Good morning. Today I'm going to be talking about behavioural science and why I think it's so important to marketers. I think today's theme around storytelling is absolutely relevant because how can we create the best stories for our customers unless we understand their motivations? And social psychology and behavioural science is all about the long-standing fundamental motivations of consumers. Now, before I get into the meat of the presentation, I thought maybe the best place to start today would be to talk about a more personal story, about how I first became interested in behavioural science. And unlike most things in life that you just gradually drift into, there was a very specific moment when I first realised how useful this topic could be to marketers. And it was on the way back from a meeting with the NHS. We'd been working with them trying to encourage people to give blood. And unfortunately, the meeting had been a bit of a car crash. We were miles off our targets. Not enough people were giving blood, and we'd had a bit of an earful from the client. So on the way back to the agency, I was desperately trying to think of tactics for our next campaign. And luckily enough, on the way back, I read a story about a lady called Jenna Vaizey. Now, has anyone heard about Jenna Vaizey? Yeah, so a couple of people. So for those of you who haven't, Jenna Vaizey was a bar worker in New York, and on the early hours of March the 13th, 1964, she had locked up a bar, driven home, and parked a car about 100 yards from a house in Queens, New York. And then unfortunately, as she walked to her front door, she was spotted by a man called Winston Moseley. And over a period of about 15 minutes, Moseley stalked her, stabbed her, and murdered her. Now, within a couple of days, this was all over the front page of the New York Times. Now, that might not sound surprising. It was a pretty brutal murder after all. But New York in the 60s was a very, very violent place. There were 636 other murders that year, and none of them made the front page of the New York Times. The reason this murder did was because supposedly, and I do stress supposedly, 37 people witnessed that attack and did nothing to intervene. So they didn't go down and call the police. They didn't go down and help. They didn't even call the police. Now, the New York Times summed this up as an example of the moral decay of the city. That how could a defenseless person be attacked despite there being so many witnesses? But two psychologists, Bibb Latané and John Darley, who lived in New York, they saw the story and thought the Times had come to completely the wrong conclusion. It wasn't that no one helped despite there being so many witnesses, it was that no one helped because there were so many witnesses. They argued there was a diffusion of responsibility among the crowd, that everyone left it up to someone else. Now, rather than just argue this from logic, they then spent the next couple of years running a variety of experiments to try and prove their point. And what they did, all the experiments revolved around a pretty similar thing. They would stage an emergency, and then they would monitor whether people went to the help, the victim. So, for example, they'd get a colleague to pretend to have an epileptic fit, and they would monitor who went and helped. And they staged those emergencies that either they were seen by one person or a group of people. And they found that people were up to twice as likely to come to a stranger's aid if they were on their own. Now, they called this the bystander effect, essentially the idea that there is a diffusion of responsibility amongst crowds, that the more people you ask for help, the less likely any one individual is to come to your aid. Now, jump back to 2004, working on the blood service, and I thought, bloody hell, this is exactly the problem we're facing on the blood service. We're going out and asking everyone to donate, and just as Latané and Darley suggest, most people are ignoring us. So having read about this bias, I then thought, well, let's try and apply it. I went and spoke to the creative agency, a lovely creative agency, DLKW, and said to them, look, why don't we make the tiniest of tweaks to your creative to try and get around this problem? Why don't we stop saying blood stocks are low in England, please donate? And why don't we start saying blood stocks are low in Basildon, please donate? Blood stocks are low in London, please donate? Blood stocks are low in Birmingham, please donate? Tailoring the creative to the individual city, the individual town, to make people feel they'd be more directly asked. It's a very, very simple tweak, but one that, when we got the results back, the cost per response 2 weeks later, one that had improved the performance of the campaign by 10, 12%. So that, to me, was a revelation. That I'd spent a few years in a media agency up till then, and no one had been talking about social psychology or behavioural science. Yet here was this body of work that I previously dismissed as irrelevant academia. There was this body of work that could have definite commercial application. And I've spent the last 15 years or so working with clients, trying to persuade them to apply some of the findings from behavioural science to their work. And I think there are three big reasons why clients, why marketers, why brands should apply the findings from behavioural science. The first is its phenomenal relevance. Now, think about what you do on a day-to-day basis. We are trying to persuade people to pay more for a brand, to switch from a competitor, to buy the brand more regularly. All of that is behaviour change. So why would you not draw on the 120-year science of behaviour change? What could be more relevant? Secondly, there's a phenomenal range to behavioural science. The bystander effect is just one of perhaps 200 or 300 biases that have been identified by psychologists. So whatever problem you're facing, there will be a particular experiment which you can use, which may not solve that problem, but will at least give you a different angle. And then thirdly, and perhaps most importantly, is the robustness of the discipline. That still too many decisions in marketing are based on the opinion of the highest paid person in the room or the most eloquent person in the room. Behavioural science is completely different. It's based on the peer-reviewed evidence of some of the leading psychologists from around the world. It's far better to make important decisions on that than someone's gut feeling. So I think those are three big reasons why we should all be interested in behavioural science. But over the last few years, what I've found is that many people are sceptical about behavioural science. They think that it can't be as good as some people claim. If it was as good as some of the boosters say, why isn't every brand using this stuff? And what I therefore wanted to do was to try and show you today that we are all influenced by these biases. You, me, everyone. So I thought the best way of doing that, rather than taking you through reams and reams of existing experiments, was to come and present some results from this survey that I sent you, because I think that will give us quite conclusive proof that we're all affected by these biases. So hopefully most of you filled that in. I thought maybe the best place to start was the first question, which you may remember, which was a very straightforward one. It was, how good at your job are you compared to your peers? Do you remember that question? Fair enough? Okay. Well, it was quite forced. I only gave you two options, above average, below average. So if they're a statistician here, they would say, well, the answer should be pretty obvious. Roughly 50% will say below average. Roughly 50% will say above average. But if they're a psychologist here, they would say, that is never going to happen. There is a very well-known bias called overconfidence. We all predictably think we are better than we actually are. So knowing that, what proportion of you, and I have blended this to get a nice robust sample size with other people this week, but what proportion of you do you think thought you were better than your peers at your job? Shout out some answers. Go on, what do you think? 36%. 36%? You're an optimist about human nature. Any advances on 36%? 82. Almost spot on. 89%. Now, before you start feeling bad, I asked this same question about 6 months ago in London at the Newsworks conference, and 96% of Londoners work in media thought they were better than average. So I may not be breaking any stereotypes about those from London. But it's a remarkably well experimented area. So Patricia Cross has run the experiment amongst psychology lecturers. People who know about the bias of overconfidence, 90% of them think they are better than average. Most ridiculously, Ola Svensson has done studies amongst drivers, and in one of his most ludicrous findings was that when he went to people in hospitals, laid up from accidents after a car crash, even a majority of these people who are demonstrably pretty bad at driving, even a majority of them think they are better drivers than average. So the point of this is twofold. Firstly, just because you feel these tweaks are so small they wouldn't influence you, don't necessarily trust that intuition. And there's a wonderful psychologist called Timothy Wilson who says we are strangers to ourselves. Just because we think a particular bias doesn't influence us, it's often not an accurate belief. And then the second point is, if people are very bad at explaining their own behaviour in their own circumstances, why is it as an industry we spend so much of our time looking at surveyed and claimed data? Psychologists would suggest that often that data is as much about what people want to believe about themselves as the truth. But that wasn't the only question I asked you. The second question I asked you was maybe a bit more puzzling, and that was a question about apples. And the question there was, how many calories do you think there are in an apple? More or less than 50. People guessed more or less. And then there was a free text box where they could put a specific answer. And in that scenario, people guessed 83 calories. Now, you might be starting to realise, though, that if anyone ever sends you a survey who's purporting to be interested in behavioural science or social psychology, there's going to be a twist. And the twist in this case was that only half of you were asked that way. The other half were asked, how many calories do you think there are in an apple? More or less than 150. So not 50, 150. Most people guess less, and then they had to put in a specific number. Again, what do you think the average answer was in that circumstance? Shout out a couple of answers. 110, almost spot on, 113. So a full 36% swing, just because that tiny, tiny tweak. Now again, psychologists would say this is completely predictable. Kahneman and Tversky, back in the mid-70s, experimented on a bias called anchoring. Essentially the idea that if you throw out a number, even if it's irrelevant, at the beginning of people's deliberations, they cannot but help be affected by it. Now, what Tversky argued happened here is that there is like most questions in life, there's not a specific answer. There's normally a zone of reasonable answers. So if you throw out 150 at the beginning, people take that as the starting place, they know it's too high, they adjust downwards until they hit the top of that zone of reasonable answers. But if people see 50 at the beginning, even if they know it's irrelevant, they take it as a starting place, they adjust upwards until they hit the bottom of that zone of reasonable answers. So in our case, 83. So you get this bizarre situation in that even though people know the number they are exposed to has no relevance, because they take it as a starting place and because they don't adjust enough, it affects their answers. Now, you might now be accepting that we are affected by these biases, but you might also, at the back of your mind, have a pretty fair objection, which would be, well, when I did that survey, I frankly wasn't paying attention. There was nothing at stake, so I didn't really think my answer through. But my customer, if they were about to buy something when there's cash at stake, surely they wouldn't be so influenced by something so small. Now, you might think that, but again, it's just not true. And I think the way to show that these biases are just as effective in commercial situations is to think about what is arguably the most effective ad campaign of all time, partially based on a bias. Now, of course, that is a very subjective opinion. So I guess over to you again. What do you think is the most effective ad campaign of all time? Coca-Cola, thank you. So who here last, week has had a Coca-Cola? Stick your hand up. Okay, so phenomenal campaign. What, 31% of people paying 90% premium for what is brown sticky water. It's a phenomenal long-term ad campaign and one of the most successful ever. But I don't think it's the most successful. So I want you to think about it slightly differently now. I want you to stick your hand up and keep it up if you have ever been married. Okay, so keep your hand up. Now, keep your hand up if you gave or received a diamond ring. Okay. So I think that might be everyone bar 2 people maybe. There were a couple of hands I think dropped around here. But let's say 95% of people bought a diamond ring. Okay, you can put your hands down. I would argue that is the most successful ad campaign of all time. And I think the reason it's so successful is that there is nothing natural about buying a diamond ring. And back in the 1940s, people were as likely to buy rubies or sapphires as they were diamonds. But then in 1947, Frances Geraghty coins this amazing line, "A diamond is forever." And she manages to fuse in people's mind the link between the durability of the stone and the enduring nature of true love. And suddenly people start thinking there's no choice when they buy an engagement ring. But Rory Sutherland has said, that's an amazing line. It's one of the best lines ever in advertising. But it's not even the best line that De Beers have come up with. The best line De Beers came up with, which is based on anchoring, is that you should spend a month's salary on your diamond ring. Think how ridiculous that is. Why would you listen to a salesman who has a pretty damn strong interest on getting you to spend as much as possible? But just as Kahneman and Tversky suggest, you throw out an anchor, in this case 4 weeks' salary. People don't quite spend that, but they started spending 2 or 3 weeks' salary on their diamond ring. Phenomenal campaign. But De Beers are one of the canniest advertisers out there, and they knew when they were onto a good thing. So 30 years later, they then start running ads saying, "Apologies, last 30 years we made a slight mistake. We've been saying you should spend a week's salary on a month's salary on your diamond ring. What we meant to say was you should spend 2 months' salary." And again, people took 8 weeks as an anchor, and they adjusted upwards till they spent 6 or 7 weeks of their salary on their diamond rings. And they didn't even stop there. In the 1980s, they launched in Japan. There's no heritage of diamond rings in Japan. So they go out and say, you spend 3 months' salary on your diamond ring. And now the Japanese spend pretty much more than any other market on their engagement rings. The clever, repeated, but very simple use of a bias has made De Beers billions of pounds. Now, I'm sure some of you might be coming up with more objections to behavioural science. You might be thinking, well, okay, I accept that I'm influenced by these biases. I accept that it can work in commercial situations in the 1940s and the 50s and the 60s. But people have changed, haven't they? We've got the internet. Any bit of information is available. We've got millennials, and they're far more interested in authentic things. Do these tweaks still work? And I think the best way to show that the fundamentals of human nature don't change, that what was relevant in the 1940s is relevant today, is to think about another campaign that was almost as successful as De Beers. And this campaign relies on a related bias to anchoring, but one called price relativity. So price relativity is the idea that consumers have no fixed conception of what is good or bad value. They don't walk around thinking they're prepared to pay £1 per unit of happiness, whether that's for a trainer or a cigarette, because it would be a ludicrously complex calculation. They work out what's good value by thinking, how much did I pay for something similar in the past? If I'm asked to pay more, this is bad value. If I'm now being asked to pay less, this is good value. Now that's interesting to marketers because it means that our perception of value is relative. And if we can change the comparison set, we can change consumers' willingness to pay by orders of magnitude. Now, lots of brands have done this. I'd argue Red Bull's done it, craft beer's doing it. But I think the best example is Nespresso. Now, if you think back to when Nespresso launched, I think if a team that wasn't a lesser team than Nestle might have launched it like this. They might have put the coffee into half-kilo bags and then sold that coffee at Sainsbury's or Tesco's. Now, if they'd done that, and if they charged the same per gram price they do now, how much do you think a 474-gram bag of coffee would cost? What's that? Oh, 30. Sorry, 30. Almost spot on, but even that is an underestimate. 34 quid would be the actual price. So I'd argue there is no way on God's earth that anyone would go to Sainsbury's, push aside a £6 bag of Dow Egberts and take home a £34 bag of Nespresso. It would feel completely wasteful. But of course what Nespresso did is they launch in pods. A pod gives you a cup-size serving. When you think of cups of coffee, you think of Starbucks. And then suddenly, the 47 pence they want for a Lungo pod looks remarkably good value compared to the £2.50 that Starbucks want. But 47 pence for a pod, £2.50 for a Costa is exactly, 47 pence for a pod, £34 for a bag of coffee. It's exactly the same per gram price. One feels a rip-off, the other feels great value. Again, another company has made billions of pounds from the simple but repeated application of a well-known bias. But to finish, I wanted to end on maybe the most kind of relevant area, I think, from behavioural science to today's kind of topic and news brands in general. And I want maybe to start with a very quick live experiment. So if you could just read out what you see on the screen when it comes up. Okay, just read it out aloud. Is that okay? Okay, here we go. Simple. We'll do it again. Okay, so what the eagle-eyed of you might have spotted is the middle digit there, the middle thing, was the same in both circumstances. But when it's surrounded by 12 and 14, it looks like 13. When it's surrounded by A and C, it looks like B. The information is not neutral. How we interpret it is dependent on the surrounding context. Now, that isn't just a case of visual illusions. It's exactly the same in advertising, in media. The place where our message appears has an effect on how that message is interpreted. Now, the academic evidence behind that is very strong. It's a wonderful experiment from a man called Michael Depp at the University of Munster. And he ran a very simple experiment in which he got 30 headlines and showed them to participants in the experiment. And the twist was that sometimes they saw those headlines in high-trust titles, sometimes in low-trust titles. And then at the end, he asked them to rate the credibility and believability of the headline. Now, when they were in low-trust titles, on average they were rated 1.9 out of 7 in terms of believability. When they were seen in high-trust titles, they were rated as 5.5 out of 7 in terms of believability. So in that particular experiment, the environment in which a message was seen had more effect on believability and credibility than the actual information in the headline. And that is one thing that I think we are forgetting too often in advertising today, that there is a programmatic race to the bottom in which we chase target audiences to the extent that we forget about target contexts. But all the work from Depp and many other social psychologists would say that would be to lose half the strength of advertising. So that was a very quick overview of some biases from behavioural science, so taking the bystander effect, anchoring, context, and price relativity. So those are just 4 biases that I think are relevant to marketers and advertisers. In your bags as you go, you'll see there's a copy of my book, The Choice Factory. There's another 21 biases that are discussed there, I think all of which are relevant to your day-to-day job. So I hope you find them useful, and if you have any questions at all, I'd love to take them. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thank you, Richard. Now I have a question. You mentioned very early on that people can be a little bit sceptical about behavioural science. And I know this year particularly, you've kind of been talking quite passionately about it. Have you found it's kind of resonating and changing people's attitudes and they're really sitting up and taking notice?
So yes, I think there has, and I think there has been a trend over the last couple of years in which people and marketers are more interested in behavioural science. So we've certainly had at the agency a couple of examples where clients, not even knowing that I specialise in the area, have gone to the account team and said, look, can you answer this question with a behavioural science angle? So I think the interest from clients is growing, and therefore I'm sure once agencies realise that clients are interested, then they will start offering this service more regularly. But that's the positive side. The negative is, I still think if you spoke to people outside of the industry, they would expect us to be spending half our day talking about psychology and behavioural science. You know, it's the study of how people think, and surely you have to know how people think if you're going to sell them stuff.
Yeah.
So I still don't think we are spending near enough time on this particular area.
Yeah, I guess it's remembering who our consumers are and putting them back. We hear it a lot, don't we? Put the consumer back at the heart of the problem, but I think we're a little dismissive of it sometimes.
But also sometimes we hear this thing of, we've got to put the consumer at the heart, or we've got to make things like emotional advertising. And I think often those claims, all they do is set up a problem.
Yep.
The brilliant thing about behavioural science is there are experiments that show you how to generate emotion. There are experiments that show you what consumers think. It doesn't just pose problems, it gives you solutions as well.
Cool. And actually I've got another one, sorry, which is, do you think, won't know the answer to this, but so De Beers, cracking example, and also Nespresso, do we think they applied behavioural science, or do you think they kind of stumbled across the solution?
Well, the De Beers example was from 1947. Kahneman and Tversky did their experiment in 1974, so it predated it. I think, and there's a wonderful line from Tversky, who was Kahneman's colleague, and he said, all I've done is catalogue things that used car salesmen and advertisers already know. So I think behavioural science is not an invention, it's a description of how people behave. So if the great copywriters didn't already realise some of this stuff, I would have big, big questions about the validity of behavioural science. Okay. But what's good about it is, we all can't be Hegartys and Birnbachs and Geraghties. Behavioural science catalogues these findings and makes them accessible to all of us.
So it makes us all a bit smarter, which can never be a bad thing. Brilliant. Oh, question.
Can I ask what news brands can do that makes them better placed to exploit behavioural science than other media platforms?
I think there is an element, of that, the context I talked about. I think that's a hugely underestimated area in advertising. So there's a fantastic historian, Lutterwack, who talks about the materialistic bias, and that, I think, plagues advertising. That because it's very easy to quantify how many members of a target audience you've met, but it's much harder to quantify the mood you reach them or the time of day you reach them, the value of those things. It's the audience that gets over-prioritised. Think back to pretty much every brief you may have received from a client will always have a target audience section. What I think we should do is including a target context section in as well. So I think there's an element of some of the strengths about newspapers that behavioural science would emphasise would be things like reaching people when they are not in a rush. There's some phenomenal experiments done around trainee priests. I think it's in the first chapter of the book that is all around that. There's the stuff around context, and I think there would be arguments about potentially mood as well, which would all fit. The other area that I think is fascinating is from a publisher point of view, I think you could use some of the lessons from behavioural science to look at why marketers or agencies don't recommend it as much. And there you've got a different set of biases. You've got this kind of love of the new. People are obsessed with what is the latest thing. We did this very simple experiment where we said to people, we described a bias called the pratfall effect. described this by saying people who admit flaws become more believable, become more appealing. And sometimes we said that experiment was from 1966, and it was actually done, sometimes 2006. And when people thought the experiment was more recent, they gave it more credibility. And I think this fascination with the latest thing is a big problem in terms of from the publishing side.
Where have you seen good examples of behavioural science providing that quantifiable data that everyone's obsessed with? You know, because I suppose the transition into it is here's quantifiable data that everyone's obsessed with. This is how you apply advice to it as well.
Yeah. So sorry, are you saying? Sorry, is it a question?
Where have you seen advice applied well to kind of targeting or quantifiable data that is kind of a barrier to people looking at behavioural science?
So. My objection about quantifiable data would not be, I wouldn't be a Luddite and say we should ignore this stuff, but I believe it has been oversold in that you can have all the data in the world, but it won't necessarily tell you anything without a series of hypotheses. And what behavioural science is brilliant at doing is generating hypotheses that you can then go and investigate. And then there are, thousands of applications. So we've done work which shows that many consumers are habitual in their purchasing behaviour, which is a big problem for any brand that wants to win over new customers. So we then started looking for what are the moments when people's habits become destabilised. So behavioural science gives a few theories, and it suggests things like the fresh start effect, beginning of the semester, beginning of the month, beginning of the year. It suggests things like windows of opportunity, that people are particularly likely to change their brands when they've undergone a big life event. So we took those theories and then we used the reams of data that we had on clients to check whether they were true. And that's, I think, which both were. We've done it for multiple different categories. And I think the two can work together well if you think that behavioural science provides the hypotheses and then you have to go out and test them using real live client data, not just lab experiments.
Brilliant, thank you. I'm going to draw a line on questions there because we could quiz you for hours, but I'm also mindful of the fact we've got lots of other stuff. And you're around at coffee, aren't you?
Yes.
So, ask a question. Richard, thank you. That was brilliant.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. Good. Thanks a lot.